most of you. I'm president of the Houston chapter of Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Thanks to all of you for being here this morning. We appreciate it. I don't know if you all heard that this past weekend, the Texas Republican Party at its state convention adopted a platform that contained a statement that says separation of church and state is a myth. Now, Americans United is a nonpartisan organization, but we disagree with that statement. We at Americans United think that preserving that separation between church and state is the only way to ensure religious freedom for all Americans. We fight every day to preserve that wall. In fact, Americans United is the only national organization that devotes 100% of its time and resources to defending that wall. Americans United does it in the courts, in and out of court, does it in Congress and state legislatures, even locally. For example, you might know that we worked with some of you to support the Houston Equal Rights Ordinance last year in the City of Houston's November election. And we all know the unfortunate outcome of that, but Reverend Lynn might touch upon, I'm not sure he will because that's a little bit outside his talk, but he might note about how now all over the country people are using their religious beliefs as a pretext for justifying discrimination. And that's something, again, that AU is fighting against every day. And Americans United also works in the arena of public opinion. We have educational programs such as this. We had Reverend Lynn speaking up last night at our annual meeting to a public program. And then it's also good to have the opportunity to get together with smaller groups such as yourselves so we can have direct engagement, both talk with you about what we do and then learn what's of interest to you and, of course, answer your questions. We've been doing this since 1947. Reverend Lynn has been with us since 1992 as our executive director. Some of you might know that he is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ as well as a licensed attorney. He got his law degree at Georgetown University Law Center, and he got his seminary, his theology degree from Boston University School of Theology. He has worked for the United Church of Christ. He has worked as the American Civil Liberties Union, and as I said, he's worked with Americans United since 1992. He has hosted a radio program as well as been a frequent guest on national radio programs and television programs. You might have seen him there. He's been a writer. He's had published essays, op-ed pieces in national chains. He's written a couple of books. This is one written a few years ago with Dr. Welton Gaddy, First Freedom First. And this is his most recent book, God and Government, 25 years of fighting for equality, secularism, and freedom of conscience, and insider's account. If anybody would like to buy a copy, there are copies over there on the table for sale for only $15. And the money does go to a good cause. Some of you have actually joined our organization. Several of you have. We appreciate that. If anybody else would care to join, membership is only $25 a year. It's a portion of it's tax deductible. The only reason that not all of that is tax deductible is because members also get this wonderful monthly magazine. I see a few of you nodding your heads. I'm glad that you agree. It's a church and state. It's award-winning. It's thin enough that it's not too much to read, but it's really good because it has both lengthy articles and short articles that keep you up to date on what's going on all over the country in this field. And then finally, as part of our education outreach efforts, we have all sorts of information pamphlets for you. We have some of them on the back table. Church and State, Your Freedom at Risk, the Religious Rights War on LGBT Americans. That's kind of a hot topic right now, so if you're interested, you can pick up one of those. We have Protect Thy Neighbor, which is a new project that Americans United started to try to fight back against these people who do want to use their religious beliefs as a pretext to discriminate. So you can find out about the effort that Americans United is doing right now, again on the back table. And one more I wanted to focus on or highlight, and that is this one, because this is the topic that Reverend Lynn's going to be talking about today. This brochure is entitled Religion, Partisan Politics, and Tax Exemption, What Federal Law Requires and Why. Now, one more thing I want to tell you about that was in the platform that the Texas Republican Party adopted this weekend. It says, tax deductions for charitable contributions are not government subsidies and give no authority for government oversight. Well, Reverend Lynn here, as I said, as both a minister and a lawyer, has a unique perspective on this issue, and he has studied the law. He knows what that law is. He's going to give you a little bit more nuanced analysis and detail than what you can find in this pamphlet. And with that, I want to turn it over to Reverend Lynn to have a conversation with you about this topic.
Terrific. I want to be sensitive to how much time folks have to stay and do this. This will not be like a law school lecture that will go on endlessly and put you into a coma, I hope. But just how long should we be able to?
Well, we told people that this would go approximately till 9:30. So again, if anybody wants to stay after that start time, 10:30, excuse me, 10:30.
Okay, 10:30. Yeah, because it would have been over already. Some people would like it. I did something like this just the other day in San Antonio, where I was for 2 days. I'm going to El Paso tonight, unless the rain is too heavy and I don't get there. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, get some participation on some issues that most people frankly don't know the answer to, and for which the other side of the political and ideological spectrum would say, no, that's wrong, I have a different idea. Do you believe that religious institutions in the United States have historically always been tax exempt? Have we ever taxed churches in America? No, we haven't. But is that because the Constitution requires that churches be tax exempt? No, it doesn't. There's nothing in the Constitution to suggest what the tax status of anything ought to be, and of course it wasn't even an income tax at the beginning of the formation of the United States. The only thing the Supreme Court said about religion is that you can be exempt as a religious organization if your exemption is part of a broad range of exemptions offered to other groups that are similar and do similar work in the community. In other words, charities, medical institutions perhaps, and even some of the groups that you may be a member of, the Sierra Club or others. You can have part of your activities declared tax exempt. There are very few restrictions on what you can do. You can't use your tax exemption for self-inurement, the self-benefit of you and your immediate family, can't do that. And you can't spend an exorbitant percentage of your money on political issues, but nobody, no church that I'm aware of ever comes close to whatever that standard is. But there's one thing you absolutely cannot do. It's what the Internal Revenue Service used to call zero tolerance, and that is endorsing or opposing candidates for public office. You cannot use the resources of your religious institution to benefit or to discredit anyone running for political office at any level. It's a zero tolerance position. Nothing should be difficult about it. But now some people say, well, wait a minute, the fact that we're tax exempt doesn't necessarily mean, does it, that the government can put conditions like the ones I've just mentioned on how we spend our money. And you might say, well, what about that Citizens United case not too long ago? I mean, that said corporations are people, and people can speak, and therefore they can speak with money, and they can spend as much money as they want, and that's perfectly acceptable. But that's not the full story. The Citizens United case, I think I and a lot of tax lawyers who study this all the time would say no, because a tax exemption really is a benefit. It's a benefit notwithstanding what the Republican platform says. It is a direct benefit. When you think of the institutions that you work with or that you run here in Houston, how important is it that you don't pay property taxes, that you don't pay income taxes? Would you say anybody think that's trivial, not important? No, that's kind of a big deal, and it's a big benefit, and it's a benefit that the government gives to you, not because they have to, but because they've chosen to do so. Back in the Ronald Reagan administration, the Secretary of the Treasury, the person who oversaw the Internal Revenue Service, had a name similar to Reagan. It was Reagan. Don Reagan was the Secretary of the Treasury. And Don Reagan was sued by a conservative charitable group over the claim that it couldn't participate using all of its funds in what would otherwise be prohibited activity. They were trying to not only elect people to office, they were also trying to spend a huge amount of money on, that would be a huge amount of money on, it's not a political comment, but on advocacy on issues. And so much so that they seem to be doing very little else with it, with the money that they took in. And they sued and they claimed that this was an unconstitutional condition, that it wasn't a subsidy of their work. And the United States Supreme Court looked at it and said, no, actually it is a subsidy. It's very important. We can condition the receipt of your tax exemption on telling you there's certain things you can't do, certain boundaries you can't cross. So you now have a statute that basically says that you can't directly or indirectly participate in, intervene in any political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for any public office. Really clear, very, very clear. Sometimes the people who do not like this law try to tell you a little bit about its history, and they often, in my judgment, give you a false history, as is frequently the case in my experience in dealing with the so-called religious right. They'll tell you this was a last-minute decision made by Lyndon Johnson under cover of darkness. He put this into the tax code, and although it is true that Lyndon Johnson did put this provision into the tax code, it was based on a long history he was having with a charitable group right here in Texas that seemed to be spending all of its money to defeat him in whatever was his next Senate election. All the money seemed to be going to defeat him, and he was irritated by that. Lyndon was irritated by many things, if you knew him or read the great tri-volumes of his life that Carroll wrote. They'll say, and nobody ever heard of this issue before. That's not true either, because just the year before Lyndon Johnson did put this into the tax code, there had been extensive hearings in the House of Representatives on this very topic. So it wasn't a surprise, and it wasn't something done at the last minute, and it was done for a very concrete purpose, and that was that Lyndon Johnson thought it was inappropriate for a tax-exempt group to spend all of its money trying to defeat anybody, including himself. Well, there were people, after this was put in, there was a guy who had a ministry, not an overseas ministry, but an out in the ocean ministry. This was very popular for a brief period of time. People would try to evade restrictions on how strong a broadcast could be by going into a ship out in the ocean and broadcasting from there, and then kind of blocking everything at that frequency. It was a terrestrial radio station. And they also wanted to spend money on a large amount of money on things they shouldn't. In 1973, there was a group called Christian Echoes National Ministry. I think it was run by a guy named Billy James Hargis. And remember him? Yeah, he was here, I think, for a while in Texas, but he moved offshore. He sued, and he unsuccessfully argued that he could not be denied a tax exemption no matter what percentage of his work was utilized for the purposes of promoting issues and promoting candidates. He lost at the United States Supreme Court. The next time that this really came up through the court system was in 2000, which is roughly the time I got to Americans United, and this was an advertisement. I literally think I saw this the first day I was at Americans United. I barely moved down from New Hampshire, where I had been living for a couple of years. And on the back page of USA Today was an interesting advertisement, and the headline was "Christian Beware, Christian Beware." And it was about the campaign that Bill Clinton was waging the first time he ran for president. It said Bill Clinton is a sinner, It explained his different sinful things they thought he was involved in. This was, of course, pre his Monica problems. And it just cited Bible verses to prove that he was a sinner. Everything he supported was sinful. At the bottom it said, if you vote for a sinner, you're a sinner too. Bible passage to support that. It cost roughly $40,000 to take out that advertisement in USA Today. It was a very big deal. And so while sitting, drinking my coffee, my wife, who is a doctor and not a lawyer, looked at that and said, isn't this illegal? And showed me this ad. And I said, good grief, this is illegal. I'm supposed to be doing something about it. So we did. I called the people in Washington. I said, I'm not there yet, I know, but this looks terrible. So we formed something called Project Fair Play. And the idea was simply everybody needs to play fairly. That means every charity, every religious and non-religious charity that's characterized as what is called a 501c3 organization can't endorse or oppose candidates for public office. It's simple, it's a very clear line. And we thought that crossed the line. Well, the people who were responsible for taking out the ad, we never found out who funded it. It was a tiny little church called the Church at Pierce Creek. One of its prominent members at the time was Randall Terry, the guy who started Operation Rescue, prominent anti-choice activist himself, and he's briefly went into country music. I like country music. I was talking to him once on that radio show I did, and I said, Randall, you know, I understand you're not making country music records anymore. You're back being an activist. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. You know, sorry to hear that your music career failed, because I wish it had worked so that you could just have kept singing songs. But he went back, and he's now a big advocate on both keeping you alive forever, whether you like it or not, and also stopping. He's one of those many people that believes, as I've often said about the religious right, that they're interested in controlling your life from the moment of conception until the moment of what they call natural death, and pretty much every minute in between. And that is, sadly, the way I think I can justifiably describe their interest. They do know what's best for everyone, and if you won't do it voluntarily, they'll be happy to force you to do it their way anyway. I was talking to Jenny.
Jenny.
Jenny. I was talking to Jenny about a recent appearance with Louis Gohmert that I had on. I was testifying on the state of religious freedom in America. And so the members that are on the panel get to ask you questions. So Louis Gohmert decided to spend his 5 minutes interrogating me on the question of why do I spend so much time worrying about the Constitution and the law instead of telling people how to get to heaven. He said there's only one way to get to heaven. And then he cited the somewhat misstated principle familiar to many of you: there is no way to the Father but through me, but through Jesus. He said if you don't preach Jesus all the time, you are stopping people from going to heaven. There are several people on the panel with him, 2 Jewish members of Congress, 1 Buddhist member of Congress from the state of Georgia, and I could see their eyes kind of roll. I'm sure they've heard this from Louis Gohmert so many times. But he just went on and on and on, and finally I said, you know, all this is very interesting. We should have a private conversation, but this is a government hearing on this. This is not what we should be talking about. He came up afterwards and he said, you know, you're probably right. We should talk about this over a meal. I said, let's have breakfast. And he said, that's a great idea. I'll get in touch. I was a year and a half ago. I'm sure it was lost. The invitation to breakfast was lost, but we didn't do that. So his idea of what you do with religious freedom in this country is very different from what I think religious freedom is, and I talked a lot about this last night. But I want to go back to the tax question, and I want to give you a couple of hypotheticals, as we used to say in law school, and then see what your response is and see if you think there's a problem. Let's say you are here in Houston, and you are in strong support of a civil rights ordinance, or you strongly oppose that civil rights ordinance, can you talk about that every week as a part of your sermon or other presentation to your congregation? Can you talk about something like that?
Yes.
Yes.
It's not a candidate.
It's not a candidate, that's right, and it's such an it's such an easy distinction. It really is, and you can do that as much as you want. As I said, I mean, you'd have to spend almost all your budget if you were an advocate of a piece of legislation or an opposition to it, even if it's not a referendum. You can talk about that so much, as long as you don't get candidates involved in it. What if there's a really important issue, though, in an election, and there's also an election with candidates involved, and the biggest issue it's some kind of abortion-related issue, and you've got people running for the Senate, and the only thing they seem to be talking about is abortion. And you talk about that, and you talk about why you're pro-choice, and one candidate is obviously pro-choice, and that's what he or she is talking about almost all of the campaign. The other candidate, totally anti-choice. Is it possible you could get in trouble if you talked about abortion in the context of that campaign, focused so intently on one issue? Yeah. The IRS thinks you might get in trouble if you did that. The IRS has rules and guidelines, and I'll tell you at the end how you can get copies of all of this if you want to go into the weeds.
But do they ever enforce them?
No, they don't. No, they don't enforce them.
And how do we change that?
That's exactly what we're going to get to. Here are a couple of other things that I just want to get a couple of these out so we kind of know what, in theory, what they should be enforcing. How about a voter registration drive in your church?
Yeah, you can do that.
Yep, no problem with that. Voter registration drive where you have a big Donald Trump banner behind it? No, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. How about you invite people that are running for office to your house of worship? You invite them all, and they all come. That's okay? Yeah. How about you invite them all, but one guy says, "I'm not coming." That's okay too. It's not your responsibility to drag them to your church or synagogue, temple, mosque. You just have to have the invitation. Ironically, within the UCC, and I know there's some of you who are UCC pastors, but you may remember when Barack Obama was invited to the General Synod. And I was contacted by some of the legal people in the UCC, and they said, "We really want to do this right. We're inviting Barack Obama. He is running for president. What can we do to discourage the appearance that this is actually an endorsement of Barack Obama?" And there were a couple things I suggested. I think they did all of them. No banners. You can't hold up a sign, Barack Obama for president. You couldn't have a table anywhere close to where he was speaking. And they specifically said, he was a senator then, Senator Obama, talk about the moral issues, talk about the issues, but please don't say you're running for president. Well, unfortunately, the latter was his responsibility, and he did speak. He did mention that he was running, as if that was a great secret, but still, he was told, and that's the kind of thing you have to do to protect the integrity of what you're trying to achieve. And I was on the phone a lot that day. People, particularly the right-wing press in America, "So Barry, you're going to turn in your own denomination." And I explained all of what I just said to you. I said, no, they worked really hard not to make this a problem. And I think they did the right thing, and I think Barack Obama should have paid a little more attention, maybe, to
the fact that he didn't and said, "I'm running for president," is that in some way the church's responsibility? One could accuse them of saying, you're not allowed to say you're running for president, nudge, nudge, wink, wink.
I think the answer to that is, if there was evidence that winking and nodding occurred, that might have still been problematic. Again, if the laws were being enforced. But I think in general, no. I mean, I think there are people, ironically, Michelle Obama, some weeks later, spoke at a Baptist convention in North Carolina, which is viewed as a swing state, and she talked incessantly about the campaign that her husband was running. And I did think that that went over the line, and in fact, we did report that incident to the Internal Revenue Service. Now, we're not looking for more complaints to file. We've filed probably 120 complaints with the Internal Revenue Service over the last decade about illegal politicking. This has become, you know, a major, was more of a problem, I think, 25 years ago than it is now. In no small measure because there was a very active Christian coalition, that was Pat Robertson's kind of religio-political entity, and he used to put out these voter guides. And voter guides are these things that have a picture of each candidate, a series of issues, and then how does the person score? Get plus means they're good, negative, not so good. Pat Robertson's voter guides usually had they'd send commentaries or questionnaires to every candidate that usually have about 100 questions, and they'd pick 10 questions. And I argued, I think pretty successfully, that what they did was they picked the 10 issues on which there was the greatest difference of opinion, and the ones that would make, in every case, Republicans look like saints and Democrats look like serial killers. And I said that once on Crossfire, that show that, you know, was no longer on the air, but and Bob Novak, who was a conservative, kind of curmudgeonly guy that was usually the conservative on the show, he had one of these voter guides with him, and I said that about the Democrats and the Republicans, and he said, "Hey Barry, I just wanted to show you something. This is a voter guide. This is for a congressional contest in Mississippi. You tell me, who are you supposed to vote for here? Look, I mean, they look like they're the same scores. Maybe you can vote for the Democrat here." He did something you're not supposed to do. I said, "Bob, just look at the back where the state issues are. You're supposed to vote Republican. You know that." Now, I didn't actually know what the state commentary was, but I was sure it was right, and it turned out that I was. But I'm not suggesting, you know, you do that too often on television. I think these rules are clear enough that they're not even, we don't even find ourselves concerned about so-called gray areas. If in the midst of a campaign, someone in the Roman Catholic Church, for example, an archbishop just says once, vote pro-life, we don't complain about that. Maybe we should, but we don't, because that's a gray area, genuine. These are not gray areas. Pastor stands up on a Sunday and says, you know, there's a big election on Tuesday. If you're having trouble getting to the polls to vote, just come to the church parking lot. We're going to have a bus out there, and we'll take you to the polling place. That's not illegal. Here's what is illegal. You get there, and you say, I'd like to go to the polling place, and the guy on the bus says, who are you voting for? If you give the wrong answer, in that particular case, any answer involving Democrat, they don't let you on the bus. Now that strikes me as so obvious, so painfully over the line, but it's not a close case. The Internal Revenue Service is not enforcing the law, and they haven't been enforcing the law for 6 years. So what do you do about that? Well, at first, you write to the Internal Revenue Service and say you want to enforce the law. If you and 100,000 other people do that, it might work. The Internal Revenue Service, if you ask them why they're not enforcing the law, they're going to say two things. One, they officially say, and that is, we have about 99 investigations that we will consider once we complete our rule-making process. rulemaking. Rulemaking is one of those bureaucratic things you learn about in an administrative law class in law school, and maybe you work on it if you're a lawyer. You almost always work on administrative regulations. This is a description of what happened because of requiring the need for these regulations. Remember Michelle Bachmann? She was a very popular conservative Republican congresswoman. We didn't like the way she was announced in a local church in her district. She was announced by the pastor as a credit to America, a great savior for this country. Just a few days before the election, the other candidates not invited, not mentioned. So we did report that, and the IRS started to look into that. And they said, wait a minute, there's a problem with this, because this Living Word Church, which is where she appeared, they started to audit it to see whether they were spending money, to see whether this incident had occurred as we had described it. And they said, no, we can't allow this investigation to continue because you, the IRS, have violated something called the Church Audit Procedures Act. And this is how the Chronicle of Philanthropy explains this decision, because it's as coherent as I can explain it. They said, Audit Act. After the Audit Act was enacted in 1984, Treasury Department issued regulations that the lowest ranking IRS official who could approve a church audit was a regional commissioner, just one level of authority below the IRS commissioner himself. But the tax agency was reorganized in 1998, eliminating the regional commission position along with a geographic structure that divided the nation into quadrants. The newly organized IRS was based on categories of taxpayers, such as small businesses and tax-exempt organizations. After the reorganization, the IRS gave the authority to order a church audit to the Director of Exempt Organizations for examination, but that was 4 management levels below the commissioner, thus not fitting into the description of a highly placed IRS official. 4 down, not sufficiently high. Well, then you would think, if you were a normal person, you would say, well, why don't they just fix that? Why don't they find out who the person is who's immediately below the commissioner? Why don't they just say, the commissioner has to do this? 6 years of rulemaking, we have not figured out in the IRS how to change that one sentence to reflect the absence of regional directors and the presence of a whole different structure. All it takes is changing one sentence, one phrase in one sentence. If you were there last night, you know I brought a monkey with me. I picked it up in the Houston airport in order to drive business to Houston. And but it's about I thought it was a convenient explanation of a story you probably heard. You put an infinite number of monkeys in a room, say, of this size, with an infinite number of typewriters, at random they will end up typing out all the works of Shakespeare, eventually. I don't think this sentence was that difficult, so I brought this stuffed monkey who I figured with one computer could probably himself have figured out, just at random, what that sentence needed to be changed to, and we wouldn't have this problem. And then we'd have no excuse for the IRS not to do this. Well, what do? Well, we continue to file these complaints because there is a statute of limitations issue that we're going to run into, where you have to have begun the investigation within a certain number of years of getting the complaint. And we're running into problems with that. But the other thing I think we need to do as members of the clergy, and we will do this directly at Americans United, but it's much more effective in my position and in my opinion if it comes and happens locally. We will send out a letter across the board. You might get it even if you're in the most liberal denomination and you can think of in this country. You might get a letter from me. It just says there are rules. You should obey the rules. You should talk to your lawyer in your church. This is not a legal advice letter, but just find out what you can and cannot do, and then ask yourself 2 questions. What does the law permit? And what is the moral responsibility of the church in this community? And if you can't answer the question, it's legal and this is a moral thing to do with the resources of my church, then I would suggest, even if the IRS doesn't investigate you, doesn't threaten you, I think you shouldn't do it anyway. Because I think that the standard of what the church is in a community is not to become a political action committee. It's not to help candidates run for office or be elected to office. I think the church, the synagogue, the temple, the mosque has a higher calling than that. And I think that to hear it from clergy within a community, I know the folks in San Antonio, including some pretty traditionally conservative denominations, are going to hold a press conference in September to talk about illegal politicking and how even without enforcement by the IRS, it's up to the community leaders and religious leaders in the community to say something to stop this from happening. Because this stuff has really gotten over the line. There's one group over in Scottsdale, Arizona, called the Alliance Defending Freedom, the ADF. They have a national campaign every year where they suggest that pastors deliberately and clearly violate the law by standing up in front of their congregation and telling them who to vote for, at least for president and for the United States Senate. And they get hundreds of pastors around the country. They want thousands, tens of thousands. They get about 100, 150 to actually do that. And then they send their sermons to the IRS. They frequently send the sermons to me too, to say, Barry, this is what we said. Come and get us. But they think I am in collusion or something with the IRS, which I'm not. We don't have any rights that anybody else has. Even when you file a complaint with the IRS, you don't get any inside information. You don't get any inside information.